chapter and remains an active member. He has a master's degree in Canadian history. I didn't think they taught history anymore.
Not since I left.
It's too dangerous to tell people how we got to be where we are. From the University of Alberta and works as a policy analyst for the provincial government. Doug, from Alberta.
Thanks. I'm really just going to do some sort of strategic thinking out loud here about Alberta and just sort of get some ideas out there, because things are moving fairly rapidly in terms of change in politics in Alberta. And so I jotted down a few ideas that, you know, the Edmonton chapter is just beginning to talk about them, and I think we will be soon, you know, reaching out to the other chapters in Alberta to talk about these as well. But anyway, I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to talk about some of these things. So the first point is kind of obvious, that politics in Alberta is famously stable. It's in many ways the opposite of Quebec. We have really boring elections. The same party has won a majority government in every election since 1971. So all of this makes Alberta a famously bad case for a candidate for electoral reform. But I like a good challenge, and I'm an optimistic individual. So here's my ideas. I mean, the first thing is, as I just said, that right now there's a considerable amount of turmoil and change taking place in Alberta politics. We have two right-wing parties. You know, we're a conservative province, and we've been dominated by one conservative party. Now we have two, and so that has led to some interesting vote splits. And the governing party, the Progressive Conservatives, have run into some problems with their leadership. Our premier recently resigned. We have an interim premier right now, and the governing party is going through a leadership process which will wind up in September. So the leading candidate in that leadership, I mean, the guy's really got a lock on it. He's a former federal minister. His name's Jim Prentice. And he's been sending out some interesting signals about wanting to reunite these two conservative parties. But of course, this isn't going to be, if he succeeds, I mean, it's not anything like the effort 10 years ago or so to unite the Conservatives at the federal level between the Canadian Alliance and the Progressive Conservative Party. Those were two opposition parties who were trying to come to grips with the reality of how are they ever going to beat the Liberals and get back into power. But in Alberta right now, the two right-wing parties, one's the government, one's the official opposition. I think the chances of any sort of merger taking place in that circumstance is really slim to none. So I think most members of both those parties, they're subject to first-past-the-post thinking, and they just want to wipe out their main opponent, right? I mean, that's what first-past-the-post kind of teaches you, is just completely dominate the situation, wipe out anybody who opposes you, because it's not about sharing power, it's about dominating the system. But there are other members, I think particularly of the Wild Rose, which is the official opposition right now in Alberta, who they've fought to build their party, and they see their party as a principled party, a party that actually stands for something. And they would not want to, they don't want to wipe out the Progressive Conservatives, because if they did that, they would essentially become the new Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta that is, as they see it, you know, sort of a mushy middle party that doesn't really stand for anything. It just holds on to power. That's not what they want. They want to get into government to actually do something. A lot of the members of the Wild Rose, I think. And so I think that makes their minds open somewhat to the arguments for proportional representation. I think much less likely, theoretically possible, is if the Conservatives, after they elect a new leader, find that they're still in the same sort of existential crisis, it would make sense for them to look at electoral reform, but I don't really hold out too much hope that we'll be able to appeal to the rational side of the Alberta Progressive Conservatives. So the next election, provincial election, which is scheduled for 2016, will very likely be a change election. And I think change elections are always the best opportunity to talk about electoral reform and to try to, make some sort of change, or at least advance our cause, advance awareness of the issue somewhat. It could potentially return a minority government, which would be a very new thing for Alberta. So in addition to the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose, we have two other parties that currently hold seats in the legislature. That's the Liberals and the NDP. The NDP, like their federal counterparts, have a fairly strong position in favor of proportional representation. The Liberals, in their last election platform, came out for the alternative vote, which was a bit of a step backwards for them on that issue. So in a minority government situation, either one of those parties could be playing an important role. So we want them both to have, obviously, strong positions on proportional representation. So just to sum things up, we have the Wild Rose Party, which is clearly influential and is possibly the next governing party in Alberta. And as I say, there's an opportunity, I think, that's opening up to build support within that party for electoral reform and hopefully proportional representation specifically. The potential for a minority government after that election would again, I think, help us, give us a better chance of advancing the cause. And so our job as Fair Vote Canada activists in Alberta, I see as pressuring political parties over the next 2 years on the issue of proportional representation, and see what we can do in terms of those political parties' platforms and policies, and awareness among their caucus members and their rank and file members, and hopefully that will yield some sort of results for us in a province where, as I say, up to this point, it's been very difficult to advance this issue. So that's really all I wanted to say about the political scene right now in Alberta.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Doug. Us in Saskatchewan always call Alberta the one-party state.
Yeah. Well, there was a famous political study done of Alberta politics back in the 1950s, and the term that individual used was actually a quasi one-party state, because obviously there's more than one party, but there's really only one party that matters. Yeah.
Right. All right. Last but not least, we have Ontario, and we have Wilf Dave, who's an Ontario lawyer, now 90% retired, so he's getting closer. He was an elected school trustee for 12 years. He knows how to be multi-partisan as president of Fair Vote Canada's Northumberland Pine Ridge chapter, but admits to being a long-time New Democrat, so he puts that aside on occasion. Pine Ridge riding is a 50% urban and 50% rural riding. Wilf has been a member of Fair Vote Canada's council since 2004 and is currently our national secretary and a very valued member of the finance committee. So, Wilf on Ontario.
When looking at proportional representation for Ontario, the first problem is the NDP. The Ontario NDP policy supporting proportional representation has been the same since 2002. But they have not made it a priority in the current election for two reasons. First, their big job today is to change the channel from the Liberal budget. Second, too many Liberals and others just say the voters have spoken in the 2007 referendum. And some may try instead to change the subject to the preferential ballot. 8 Liberal MPPs did support PR in 2007, and 3 of them are still running this year, but none of them are talking about it either. So that referendum is why Fair Vote Ontario decided in 2009 to focus on the federal level where PR is most needed. And again, the 2011 Ontario election, unlike the federal election, did not give Ontario a false majority government. So the history of the issue in Ontario is not what we raise with the public. However, activists do need to understand it. The NDP's policy was and is a regional mixed member proportional system, MMP. The 2002 convention resolution was party lists to be developed and applied at a regional rather than provincial level. The NDP's task force had held hearings all across Ontario, and they concluded that the North, for example, must be a separate region. Former Liberal Attorney General John Garretson also shows the problem. He had been pushing for PR since he was first elected to the legislature in 1995, when he found himself facing a Conservative government with, of course, a false majority. Garretson knew exactly what model he wanted. I and 2 other Fair Vote Canada members met him in 2004 in his Kingston office, shortly before Dalton McGuinty announced the whole Citizens' Assembly process. And it was really quite funny. We had gone there to lobby him, and he lobbied us. He explained to us the German system, as he called MMP. Although Garretson had been raised in the Netherlands, he was no fan of the Dutch PR model. And he was quite specific. The top-up MPPs should be elected regionally. Of course, that was the NDP's model too. The regions, he said, should not be too large. Kingston should not be lumped in with Ottawa. The Mid-East Lake Ontario region and Ottawa have divergent interests. And Scarborough, he said, should not be represented by someone from Etobicoke. So all that would have meant about 9 or 10 regions with maybe 13 or 14 MPPs in each. But the model for the 2007 referendum, designed by the 103 members of the Citizens' Assembly, had province-wide closed lists, not the mid-sized regions both Garretson and the NDP wanted. Despite this, Garretson supported MMP in the referendum. He said publicly, "Nobody is ever 100% right, and nobody is ever 100% wrong. Governing is the art of compromise. There's nothing wrong with having the governing party take into account smaller parties." I wish the Liberals had followed through on Garretson's attitude. In that referendum, support for MMP dropped in proportion to distance from Toronto. Support was lowest in Northern Ontario, despite that being the NDP's strongest region, because the Citizens' Assembly model gave no assurance that Northern votes would elect Northern MPPs. Couldn't be solved. The Law Commission of Canada in 2004 had designed an MMP model after 16 public consultations across Canada. We had all mostly thought it was the right model for Ontario too, until the Citizens' Assembly surprised us, frankly, with their closed province-wide list model. The Law Commission had recommended an open list mixed member system that provides voters with the option of either, with their second vote, endorsing the regional ticket or of indicating a preference for a candidate within it. They said that their model was inspired by the regional MMP models used in Scotland and Wales, which had regions of 12 or 16 MPs. And they said, based on the feedback received during the consultation process, many Canadian voters would most likely desire the flexibility of open lists in a proportional system. Allowing voters to choose a candidate from the list provides voters with the ability to select a specific individual and hold them accountable for their actions. So what went wrong with the process in 2007? This may not matter much, however, knowing the history may be useful. The process started a year later than planned and ran out of time. That's a common problem with citizens' assemblies. Happened in BC as well. When the Liberals won the 2003 election, They had spent 60 years in the political wilderness, minus only 5 years in office. And in 47 of those years, they had faced a government with a false majority, that is, elected by a minority of voters. So in 2003, they remembered for a few years why they needed PR. By 2007, most of them had started to forget. The Citizens Assembly's chair, George Thompson, spoke to our annual general meeting after the referendum. He said, if those 103 citizens had had another 6 or 8 weeks to deliberate, he felt some elements might have been different, like regional lists and open lists. Those citizens had decided on province-wide lists very early in their process. They had been told they could revisit that decision later. Once they decided on 39 top-up MPPs, regional lists became highly possible, and so open lists would have been possible too. But by then, they did not, in fact, have time to revisit regional lists or open lists. If the process had started a year earlier, they would have. Secondly, in the few months between May and the referendum, no major party even had enough time to design a nomination process for this model. Those candidates on the province-wide lists were supposed to be nominated democratically, but the model's opponents said it sounded like parties would appoint those 39 MPPs. The public had not enough time to understand the Citizens Assembly's recommendation, again due to the late start. Even the Globe and Mail editorially concluded soon after the referendum that Ontario's next government should take a more serious stab at the issue. Marie Boone-Triani, the Minister of Democratic Renewal at the time, said publicly that she agreed with us that the Citizens Assembly process should have begun earlier. She had remained neutral during the referendum campaign, but she did vote for MMP. She said, I think it would have been an exciting change. So, where does that leave us? Reformers sometimes want to refight the 2007 referendum by proving it was unfair. True, the government refused to give every voter a copy of the recommendation, unlike in New Zealand and BC. True, most voters didn't understand it at all. Zero public education. Polls show of those who did understand it, the majority supported it. Still, the fact is province-wide closed lists were a hard sell. We can't ignore the common fear that MMP would have given too much influence to party bosses in Toronto who would say who gets on the party's lists. Nor can we ignore the fear that list MPPs would not be accountable to voters. Most New Democrats and other reformers did want regional lists. So, the closed province-wide list model was not popular with voters outside Toronto. We can accept that verdict. Every MPP should be personally elected by the voters. Designing a good MP model was, in fact, too complicated for 103 random citizens because of the limited time allowed. So, actually we're back to the Law Commission's model. Despite Ontario's 2011 minority government, PR would still have made some difference to the result. On a regional level, Liberal voters in central Ontario from Kawartha Lakes and Simcoe County to Perth, Huron, Grey, Bruce would have been represented. NDP voters in eastern and central East Ontario, York and Durham regions, and central West Ontario would have been represented. Green Party voters would have elected at least 3 MPPs, and the Conservative caucus would not have left out Toronto, Peel region, and Northern Ontario. But, of course, the main reason Ontario voters are now waking up to PR is the thought of a false majority government at Queen's Park as we have in Ottawa. So this is a great preparation for next year's federal campaign.